Hi, thanks for joining me. Today's tutorial I'm going to show you a flower on the back of this Kirkland brand photo quality paper. We're actually going to use the non-glossy side. You can see that's kind of got a shine to it. That's the glossy. I'm looking for the back side, and it's a matte or flat side. I've cut it down into a smaller shape, probably 5.5 by 4.25, and I'm going to roll some Scotch tape around. I've done it already, and affixed it to the shiny side or the glossy side so that that matte side is facing up and adhered to my Lazy Susan. So easy for me to work on. There's isopropyl alcohol involved. That's 91% solution. That's what I recommend. I use it in this small quilling bottle. It's got a very, very tiny nozzle, so allows just really tiny drops of alcohol to come out. And I also occasionally will use these eyedroppers. I don't in this particular video, but they're a good alternative if you don't have that really tiny nozzle, little bottle. So I'm going to start with the Mermaid alcohol ink. This is going to form some of the brighter color in my flower. And wherever I drop this ink is going to be roughly the center of the flower, roughly where the stamen will go at the end if you want to have stamen, or at least from where the petals originate. So I take my airbrush, I have it set at about 20 psi, just for those who have an airbrush system and you want to know what pressure to use. And I'm just, looks like a little chickie, doesn't it? A little duck. But what I'm doing is just drying up that little spot of ink that I've put down. It was only 2 or 3 drops. Doesn't matter that it's not perfectly round. It's just a general idea of where that center is going to be. And this is a pitch black alcohol ink. You'll notice I don't shake either of these two. They're not mixatives. They don't have any mica in them, so no glitter quality to them, so they don't need to be shaken. And again, I've taken my airbrush. It has no ink inside it. I'm just using it for the air, and I'm blowing it and moving the Lazy Susan around so that I can get the black ink to set on top of the mermaid ink. And it takes a couple of minutes. You could blow on it too. And then I've got that little nozzle, tiny nozzle with the isopropyl alcohol in the bottle. And I put down a drop and then I let it sit for just a couple of seconds to pick up some of the color. And then I brought in my airbrush. And there is a technique to this. It depends on whether you want long stringy petals or you would prefer fatter petals or you want all joined petals. And that's something that you have to kind of learn for yourself, whether you're blowing through a straw or you're using an airbrush or you're using a spritzer. Tim Holtz has sort of a puffer type spritzer that you can use for his distress felt pens, or distress markers rather, which I sometimes use. So that technique is something you really need to learn, but you'll see that I move quite slowly. And also on that last petal, after I blew the petal outward from the center, I dropped another little piece, a little rather drop of alcohol onto the end where most of the ink pigment had settled. And that had the effect of picking up the ink, and then I blew the ink back toward the center. I just did it with that last couple too, but it didn't show it very well as an example. So again, I let it sit for a couple of seconds, and then I blow the ink out. Drop a little bit of the isopropyl alcohol on the end where the pigments have accumulated, and then I can send some of that ink back to the center, which is great. It has the effect of leaving some shadow, some darkness and light on the petals, which makes them a lot more realistic looking, and that's kind of neat. And so this is something that I've been doing on my own with different types of alcohol ink techniques, certainly not this one, but I knew that it worked in past techniques to get the folds and shadows that I really liked in some of the other images that I had done. So when I started using the air, I always want to say air gun, and it's not, airbrush, to do these flower type shapes, I thought that blowing the ink back toward the center would give me somewhat the same kind of shading and light. It really does. So I quite like that. And as you can see, as I move along, I don't necessarily go in any special direction. Because I have the Lazy Susan, I can really give myself an all-round view of what's happening on the image. I can direct myself over to where I want to be. I'm actually left-handed, which is why I'm holding the airbrush in my left hand. But I'm sort of accustomed to seeing things in a certain way, and the Lazy Susan helps me to be able to give myself the perspective that I'm looking for and an all-round kind of direction. You don't have to have a Lazy Susan. I'll just say that they come in very handy. So that's why I like to use them. You'll also see that some of those sort of petal forms have got almost like little feathery kind of edges to them. They're not perfectly smooth. And if that's something you don't care for, then that's something that you'll work on with your technique so that you can avoid having those little feathery bits, or you can avoid having long stringy bits, which you'll see coming out here. I don't mind them. What I do is kind of incorporate one petal into others. I make a skinny petal ultimately look like the vein of another one, which is what you see here. And then again, having the effect of blowing that ink back a bit, I get more shading, and you can almost create little veins. And the feathery bits, if you get really good at this, you can, in terms of your ability to control the ink and whatnot, and the brush, you'll be able to cover up those feathery bits with a smoother looking petal. And again, for my purposes for this tutorial, and for me just in general, I sort of take what comes and I work with it. So I enjoy all kinds of flowers. There's no perfect flower. And so I just enjoy the process, as it were, and just really, I get a lot of excitement actually out of seeing those colors come out. And so where that mermaid starts to really appear down toward the bottom here on the sort of the bottom of your screen, or the left, bottom left, and what I'm working on is to draw out some more of that color, because it contrasts so beautifully with the black and gray, and then that sort of purple blue that's coming out. That purple blue is it speaks to the pigments that were used to create the black ink. So there was definitely some dark purples and blues, pardon me, in that ink. And that's why you see that coming out as more of the isopropyl alcohol gets laid down and has the effect of breaking up those pigments. It leaves behind just hints of what was used to create that black. And that last one that I did also pulled up a bit of the mermaid. You'll recall the mermaid, which was kind of irregular in that it was sort of sticking up and around. That's a good thing, because you might not see it underneath the black, but as you're working and going around like this, it's going to have the effect. The alcohol dropping on the page is going to have the effect of pulling out those colors, and then as you spread them out, they'll start to reveal themselves. So this to me is such it's a beautiful technique for the outcome, but I have to say, again, the process to me is almost equally as beautiful and as exciting as the final result. So really all I'm doing here is deciding how much I want to work this piece. In other words, how many petals do I want coming out of it? Where do I want more color? And ultimately, as with any of this type of work, and I suppose with any art, but as I've always said in my tutorials, it's the big secret, I guess, or the big decision is, when do I stop? And that's really a personal decision, and it's something that you know, requires sort of you stopping sometimes, and actually even stepping away and coming back and deciding if that's where you want it to end, and in terms of a finished piece. So what I'm doing here is I've broadened that center area a little bit, because ultimately what I'll be doing is putting some dots of black and white to create the center stamen. And I like to have some of the brightness still showing on the inside, because that would be, again, where the light would be hitting from the inside. There you can see a couple of feathery bits. All I did was dropped a tiny bit of alcohol on top of them before I used the airbrush to blow them out a bit further and just give them a bit more interest. You can't really tell if it's 2 petals or 1. It doesn't really matter. Again, it may matter to you, and if that's the case, then this is something that you want to get practiced at. If you don't have an airbrush system, then certainly you can use a straw. Larger straws tend to make larger petals. And there's a technique to blowing through a straw just like there is to using an airbrush system. So it really is whatever you've got, whatever you're comfortable with. The other thing that you'll notice is that I've blown some of the ends. I haven't necessarily blown the back again because I want those petals, as it were, to look a bit thicker toward the end and not just skinny streams. So some of the dots, the dots of ink ran along the edge of the page, and I'll crop those later. So I've picked up my dotting tool and a little piece of plastic packaging that I use over and over again, and my snow cap mixative. And because it's a mixative, it has a little ball inside of it, which means that it has all kinds of wonderful bits inside that really need to be mixed together well in order to work effectively. So I am shaking and shaking and shaking off screen. And just while I'm shaking off screen, because I did not edit out any of that, I will just say that going back again to where there's sort of dribbles along the edge of the card, the piece in front of you, you can see them sort of along the top and along the left-hand side. And sometimes it's kind of fugly where the petals end. That's where you crop. So I never ever cut these pieces of paper exactly to the size I want. I make them a little bit generous. I assume that I'm going to be cropping off at least a little bit. So back to my dotting tool, and the image underneath is dry. All that alcohol ink is completely dry. So as I place the white snow cap roughly where that center of the flower is, or where I've chosen for it to be, and of course that's entirely up to you. And what I'm doing is just laying down as many drops as I can, as quickly as I can, because this, like any alcohol ink, the mixative as well is a solvent base, and it dries really quickly. So we're just going to go through here. I'm going to be drop, 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 drop. Very boring, but this is definitely something that you need to do if you want this type of a look for that middle of the flower. Some flowers don't really show any stamen. You are welcome to leave it closed completely. I might suggest that you try to leave some dark pigment in the middle if that's what you're going to do, because if it's a closed area in the center, it's going to look like it's receding a bit. And for those of you who are well versed in visual arts and light and shadows and all of that, this is going to seem like awfully redundant information, but not everybody has that information, so that's why I'm repeating it. And back I go with the pitch black, and this is going to give that center a little bit of depth. And so I'm not fancy. I just pour a couple of drops into that packaging material. And by the way, I just clean the packaging material out with some isopropyl alcohol when I'm done with it. At the very end, I clean it out with a paper towel or something. Make sure that I clean all my dotting tool doesn't have any ink left over on it, just because it's going to get mixed up with other inks. You'll notice I didn't clean the dotting tool in between using it between the white and black, and in fact even later here I'll add a bit of isopropyl alcohol and mix the two a little bit. It doesn't really matter for what we're doing here. What is really happening here is that the black is now going on top of the white that I laid down. The little white dots weren't completely dry, not all of them anyway. And so then we're going to get really interesting variations of grays. It's going to pick up a little bit of the blue, the mermaid from behind, and the blue purple that was, as I pointed out earlier, part of the black pigments that made up the black ink. And so wherever it's not completely dry, they're going to mix a bit. But what I want in the end is for an all-over mix of black, white, and different grays. So it looks as natural as possible, and a little bit of the blues in there as well, because those colors are going to get pulled out just because they're part of the flower. So I'll continue doing this. It takes a little while. I do like, I'll say, using this tiny little piece of packaging material which has a lip on it, because it's flexible, it's small, I can bring it close to the piece. Not once yet have I ever flicked it with the dotting tool, for example, and thrown dots all over the place, but it's just not in the way. And here I've put in just a bit more of the snow cap, the white, and I realized that that middle of section is probably still a bit wet. So now I take the airbrush and just dry that middle section right off. So that's completely dry. And before the snow cap gets too dry, you can see that the dotting tool is actually making lines in it. So you can tell that it's drying fairly quickly. I'm just going to go over and make some nice bright white dots right on top of everything that I've done. And then I think in a couple of seconds is when I realize that the ink is almost completely dry. So what I'll do is just pick up some of the isopropyl alcohol bottle, in the bottle, pour a little bit in, just a couple of drops. Use my dotting tool to mix it around a bit. I even go into the black a bit because again, it doesn't really matter at this point. I just want lots of different colors. It looks like different heights. You could, if you chose not to do all dots, you could certainly do dots and little stripes even. Really, you're just trying to get it to look as natural as possible. And most people are going to see it from a bit of a distance. Not that it doesn't look great up close, but you're really just giving the idea that it's the center of the flower. It needn't look absolutely perfect unless, of course, that's your thing. And if that's your thing, carry on and get lots of practice. So I'm just giving you a spin, showing you the final product, as it were. I do end up cropping about 1/4 of an inch from each side. And here's the card mounted both. It's mounted, and I'm showing you both vertically and horizontally just to give you an idea of what the image looks like up close and on the card. Thanks again for joining me.